The macabre history of the Hargroves. They raised 10 kids beneath a church floor. The First Baptist Church of Millhaven had stood as the spiritual heart of the small Ohio town for over a century. Its white wooden steeple pierced the sky like a prayer reaching toward heaven, and its hand-carved pews had witnessed generations of baptisms, weddings, and funerals. But beneath its hallowed floors lay a secret so dark that when it was finally revealed, it would shake the faith of an entire community. Ezekiel and Ruth Hargrove had been pillars of the congregation for 37 years. Every Sunday morning, they occupied the third pew from the front, their hands folded in perpetual prayer, their voices raised highest during hymns. Ezekiel served as a deacon, his deep baritone voice commanding respect during scripture readings. Ruth led the women's auxiliary, organizing bake sales and charity drives with unwavering dedication to the 1,200 residents of Millhaven. The Hargroves represented the very best of Christian devotion. They were the first to volunteer for church cleanings, last to leave after services, and always ready to counsel young families struggling with their faith. Pastor William Coleman often praised them from the pulpit, holding them up as examples of what true believers should aspire to become. But the Hargroves harbored a secret that would have horrified their fellow congregants. For over 2 decades, they had been living a double life that violated every principle their church claimed to uphold. The discovery began with a routine maintenance inspection in October 2023. During the church's annual foundation check, contractor Mike Reynolds noticed irregularities in the floor beneath the altar. The floorboards seemed newer than the rest of the structure, and there appeared to be a hollow space underneath that didn't match the building's original blueprints. When Reynolds mentioned his findings to Pastor Coleman, the elderly minister initially dismissed the concerns. The church had undergone numerous renovations over the decades, and it wasn't unusual for structural modifications to create inconsistencies. But Reynolds persisted, explaining that the hollow space was larger than any normal crawl space should be, and that he had detected what sounded like ventilation systems running beneath the sanctuary floor. Pastor Coleman's curiosity was finally piqued when Reynolds mentioned hearing faint sounds from below during the previous Sunday's service. Initially attributed to settling wood or small animals, the noises had occurred with suspicious regularity, almost as if they were responding to the activities above. The investigation that followed would uncover one of the most disturbing cases of child exploitation and religious manipulation in American history. When authorities obtained a warrant to examine the church's foundation, they discovered that the Hargroves had spent years secretly excavating and constructing an elaborate underground chamber system. Using their positions as trusted church leaders, they had gained unrestricted access to the building during off hours, slowly transforming the space beneath the sanctuary into something that could only be described as a subterranean prison. Chambers stretched nearly the entire length of the church, divided into multiple rooms connected by narrow corridors. Ventilation shafts had been carefully concealed within the church's existing structure, and electrical systems had been illegally tapped to provide minimal lighting. The construction was crude but effective, designed to house human beings while keeping them completely hidden from the world above. What investigators found in those chambers defied comprehension. 10 children, ranging in age from 8 to 23, had been living in complete isolation beneath the church for most or all of their lives. None of them had birth certificates, social security numbers, or any official record of their existence. They had been born and raised in darkness, told that the world above was evil and that they were special chosen ones, protected by God's will. The eldest, a young woman later identified as firstborn, had never seen sunlight. Born in the underground chamber in 2000, she had spent her entire 23 years believing that the cramped rooms beneath the church represented the entirety of God's creation. She spoke in a strange dialect that mixed biblical language with the limited vocabulary the Hargroves had taught their captives. The children had been systematically brainwashed to believe that they were the remnants of humanity, saved by the Hargroves from an apocalypse that had destroyed the outside world. They were taught that the sounds from above, the hymns, the sermons, the footsteps of congregants, were the voices of angels, who would one day welcome them into heaven if they remained pure and obedient. Each child had been assigned a number, rather than a name, reinforcing their dehumanization and the Hargroves' absolute control over their identities. They wore simple white robes made from bedsheets and were fed a diet consisting primarily of bread, water, and canned vegetables. Medical care was non-existent, and several of the children showed signs of malnutrition and developmental delays. Consistent with long-term abuse, the psychological manipulation employed by the Hargroves was particularly insidious. They had convinced the children that any questioning of their situation was sinful, that curiosity about the outside world was evidence of Satan's influence, and that their suffering was a necessary sacrifice for their eventual salvation. Children had been taught to confess their impure thoughts daily and to accept physical punishment as divine correction. Investigation into the children's origins revealed the true scope of the Hargroves' deception. Over the course of 25 years, they had systematically targeted vulnerable pregnant women, drug addicts, homeless individuals, and undocumented immigrants, convincing them to give birth in secret and surrender their babies for safekeeping. The mothers were told their children would be placed with loving Christian families, never suspecting that their babies would disappear into the underground chambers beneath Millhaven's most respected church. The Hargroves had used their reputation in the community to facilitate these arrangements. As trusted church leaders, they often counseled young women facing difficult pregnancies, presenting themselves as compassionate advocates for life. Their connections within local social services and their carefully cultivated image of righteousness had allowed them to operate without suspicion for decades. Church records revealed that the Hargroves had made numerous charitable donations over the years, money that was actually being used to purchase supplies for their hidden captives and to pay off the occasional social worker or healthcare provider who might ask uncomfortable questions. They had even established a fake charity called Children of Light Foundation to launder funds and provide cover for their activities. The most heartbreaking discovery was a journal kept by Ruth Hargrove, documenting her twisted justification for their crimes. She wrote extensively about their divine mission to raise a generation of pure children untainted by the corruptions of modern society. She described the underground chamber as a sacred nursery where they were preparing the chosen ones for their eventual role in God's kingdom. As Chapter 1 concluded, the full horror of the Hargroves' operation was still being uncovered. The 10 rescued children were in protective custody, undergoing intensive medical and psychological evaluation. But their rescue was just the beginning of a story that would reveal how faith could be weaponized to justify the most heinous acts of evil, and how an entire community could be deceived by those they trusted most. The integration of the Hargrove children into the outside world proved to be an extraordinary challenge that tested the limits of modern psychology and social services. Each child required specialized care to address decades of isolation, malnutrition, and psychological manipulation. The youngest, an 8-year-old boy known only as Number 10, had never learned to speak properly and communicated primarily through a system of hand gestures developed within the underground chambers. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a specialist in cult deprogramming brought in to assist with the children's rehabilitation, described their condition as unlike anything she had encountered. In 30 years of practice, the children exhibited symptoms consistent with severe Stockholm Syndrome. Defending the Hargroves, even after learning about the outside world and initially begging to be returned to their underground prison, the eldest child, firstborn, became the key to understanding the full scope of the Hargroves' psychological control. Through painstaking interviews conducted over several months, she revealed the intricate system of rules and punishments that had governed life beneath the church. The children had been subjected to daily purification rituals that included prolonged periods of silence, forced fasting, and physical discipline for any behavior deemed impure. Perhaps most disturbing was the revelation that the Hargroves had convinced the children that the church services above were actually elaborate tests of their faith. The children had been taught to listen carefully to the hymns and sermons, memorizing every word as evidence of their devotion. They believed that Pastor Coleman and the congregation were divine beings watching their progress, preparing to judge their worthiness for salvation. The investigation into the Hargroves' methods revealed a sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation that suggested they had not developed their techniques in isolation. FBI behavioral analysts discovered that Ezekiel Hargrove had corresponded extensively with members of various cult organizations, studying their indoctrination methods and adapting them for his underground operation. Among his personal effects, investigators found detailed notes on sensory deprivation, psychological conditioning, and what he termed sacred isolation. He had studied the techniques used by religious extremists throughout history, borrowing elements from medieval monastic traditions, modern cult practices, and even prisoner of war interrogation methods to create his system of control. Ruth Hargrove's role in the operation was initially underestimated by investigators, who assumed she had been a reluctant participant in her husband's scheme. However, her own writings revealed that she had been an equal partner in planning and executing their crimes. Her journal contained detailed observations about each child's psychological development and recommendations for corrective measures. When they showed signs of independent thinking, the couple had even documented their long-term plans for the children, intending to eventually use them as the foundation for a new religious movement. They believed that children raised in complete isolation from worldly influences would become perfect vessels for divine revelation, capable of leading humanity back to righteousness. The underground chamber was meant to be the first of many such facilities, part of a grand design to reshape Christianity according to their twisted vision. The impact on the Millhaven community was devastating. Church attendance plummeted as congregants struggled to reconcile their faith with the horrors that had been perpetrated beneath their sanctuary. Many parishioners reported feeling physically ill when they realized they had been unknowingly worshiping above children who were suffering in darkness just feet below. Pastor Coleman, who had served the church for over 20 years, resigned immediately upon learning of the Hargroves' crimes. In his final sermon, delivered to a congregation of barely 50 people, he spoke through tears about the crisis of faith that the revelation had created. He questioned how he could have failed to recognize the evil that had festered within his own church and wondered whether his ministry had been nothing more than unwitting cover for unspeakable crimes. The legal proceedings against the Hargroves became a media sensation, drawing attention from across the country. Ezekiel Hargrove, then 71 years old, showed no remorse during his trial, continuing to insist that he had been following God's will. He quoted scripture extensively during his testimony, presenting his crimes as acts of divine obedience rather than child abuse. Ruth Hargrove's defense team attempted to portray her as a victim of her husband's manipulation, but the evidence from her journal and the testimony of the rescued children painted a different picture. The children described her as the more hands-on enforcer of the underground rules, the one who administered punishments and conducted the daily indoctrination sessions. The trial revealed additional shocking details about the operation. The Hargroves had been planning to expand their underground facility, with construction materials hidden in various locations around the church property. They had also been in contact with like-minded individuals in other states, sharing their methods and encouraging the establishment of similar operations. The prosecution presented evidence that the Hargroves had prevented at least 3 of the older children from escaping over the years, using a combination of physical restraints and psychological manipulation to maintain control. One 17-year-old had nearly reached the surface during a rare moment when the Hargroves were away, but had been so terrified by glimpses of the outside world that he had voluntarily returned to the chambers. Below. Both Ezekiel and Ruth Hargrove were convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping, child abuse, false imprisonment, and conspiracy. Ezekiel received life in prison without the possibility of parole, while Ruth was sentenced to 60 years. Their convictions were seen as a rare victory for justice in a case that had shaken the faith of an entire community. The First Baptist Church of Millhaven was demolished 6 months after the discovery, despite efforts by some community members to preserve the historic building. The underground chambers were filled with concrete, and the entire site was converted into a memorial park dedicated to the victims of religious extremism. 10 oak trees were planted in the circle, each bearing a simple plaque with the name chosen by one of the rescued children as they learned to embrace their individual identities. The children's recovery became a testament to human resilience. With intensive therapy and support, most of them gradually adapted to life in the outside world. Firstborn, who chose the name Sarah in honor of Dr. Mitchell, eventually learned to read and write, becoming an advocate for other survivors of religious abuse. Number 10, renamed David by his foster family, overcame his communication difficulties and began attending regular school. Showing remarkable intelligence despite his traumatic early years, the case prompted significant reforms in religious oversight and child protection services. New protocols were established for monitoring religious organizations that work with vulnerable populations, and training programs were developed to help social workers recognize signs of religious extremism and abuse. The story of the Hargrove children also became a powerful reminder of the importance of questioning authority, even when it comes wrapped in the cloak of religious respectability. Their survival and eventual recovery proved that even the most systematic attempts to break the human spirit could be overcome with proper care and support. The empty lot where the First Baptist Church once stood serves as a permanent reminder to the people of Millhaven that evil can hide behind any facade, even the most sacred. But the 10 oak trees growing there also represent hope, proof that even children raised in darkness can learn to flourish in the light, and that truth, no matter how long buried, will eventually find its way to the surface. The Hargrove case remains one of the most disturbing examples of how religious authority can be exploited to facilitate abuse, but it also stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of a community to confront its darkest truths and work toward healing. Thank you for watching another tale unfold here on NW Storytime. Every story hides a secret, and tonight you uncovered another one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us keep the secrets alive. Until next time, stay curious,